Good morning to our attendees from the United States and Canada, and good afternoon to our attendees from the Middle East and Europe. On behalf of Aphrodite NGO, let me start with my endless thanks to our speakers for accepting the invitation to be part of this webinar, and a great appreciation for everyone who have signed in as an audience. Today's topic for discussion is extremely trending. As you can see, the COVID-19 pandemic took the world by surprise. Lockdown appears to have slowed down the spread of the coronavirus, but we are all witnessing its impacts on our lives, affecting our social, professional, financial, political, and mainly economic structures. So this webinar is an opportunity and an eye-opener to discuss how will COVID-19 shake the economy and the politics of the world. And I would like to welcome the prestigious panel we are having here. As you can see on the screen alongside me, Dr. Otaviano Canuto, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, former Vice President at the World Bank and former Executive Director in the International Monetary Fund. Ms. Sandrella Merhej, the Lebanese lawyer and political activist. And I really thank you, Ms. Sandrella, for your generous support accepting the invitation to have an intervention in this webinar. Lord Alexander Carlile, the British barrister and the crossbench member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. He won't be able to attend this live webinar due to an urgent governmental meeting regarding the COVID-19 situation, but he insisted to participate by recording a video. And finally, Dr. Ahmad Zein, the political activist and the president of Aphrodite NGO. For technical reasons, kindly be informed that all the attendees will be muted until the questions and answers session. As for now, I will start with Dr. Ahmad to share his insights regarding the impacts of the coronavirus, and thank you all in advance.
Thank you all for this introduction. Again, let me thank our panelist, Dr. Otaviano, lawyer Sandrella, and really thank you for Lord Alexander, who insisted on sending and recording his speech before entering a governmental meeting. And you can know that this urgent governmental meeting is related to COVID-19. We see it's shaking the whole world, and UK has been affected a lot by this pandemic. Okay. To talk about this topic, a lot of people, they compared COVID-19 as a big fall to the Berlin Wall and to the collapse of Lehman Brothers. COVID-19 is actually shaking the whole world and dominating the political, economic, and social news. Even when we open to the sports world, it's only talking the pandemic language. Yeah, when we look to any news on the website, we can see only coronavirus. All aspects are affected by the corona. At the beginning of the pandemic, economists were expecting a recession similar to 2008. But after 2 months, experts are unfortunately more pessimistic and comparing the post-COVID-19, after the COVID-19 economy, to the Great Depression in 1930. Believe me, I've heard this. Even some economists, they are expecting worse recession than 1930. How will the world look after COVID-19 when it ends? Actually, now nobody would tell you when the COVID-19 will end. This much is certain: a disease that needs magnification thousands of times to be seen has shattered lives, disrupted markets, and exposed the competence of government, especially those governments that we used to consider them previously as developed. And we have the right to ask, will coronavirus lead to permanent shift in political and economic power in ways that will become apparent only later. Actually, this is what we will hear from our panelists. My speech, which I'll try to be very quick, will tackle 4 important points. One, a world that with not a much of a freedom, prosperity, and openness. I mean, after COVID-19. The decline of the international dominance of globalization. A lot of people are talking after COVID-19, globalization will not be as we have seen it. China will become the new focus of the economic industries. And finally, stability, not profitability. So I go back to my first point, a world with not as much of a freedom, prosperity, and openness. Nationalism, will be more recognizable after the pandemic. More crisis management approach will be adopted by governments, which has shown a lot of weakness in this. And the majority will be unwilling to abandon those new controls when the crisis is over. Most importantly, we are hearing the voices of West to East is the major shift that economists and politicians are visualizing post-COVID-19. South Korea and Singapore are considered the best countries to respond to the crisis, and I would proudly say Lebanon is among the top. And after major mistakes at the beginning of the pandemic, China started to respond well to this international challenge. On the other hand, the response in Europe and America is considered sluggish and chaotic by comparison, further ruining the brand of Western civilization. What won't be modified is the basically conflictive nature, which we'll always see, of world politics. Previous plagues, including the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919, did not end great powers. Neither COVID will do, but we are expected to witness further withdrawal from hyper-globalization and more shelter in national governments for protection from future crises. Unquestionably, coronavirus will create a world with not as much of freedom in all life aspects that we witnessed 2 decades ago, and less prosperity in both economic and technological aspects, and a shift to health industry, which was really neglected by the major of countries worldwide, especially USA. Like a lot of people now are asking the USA government, we are paying more than 30% of our salaries for health. Why should we be treated in hallways in a hospital? And we will see more towards the life that we had seen more in the 1980s. We will see more life going back to the 1980s with less globalization. The coronavirus pandemic could be the straw that breaks the camel's back of economic globalization. The decline of the international dominance of globalization, many incidents marked during the COVID-19 pandemic, are expected to have huge influence on world collaboration among nations post-coronavirus. To start with, the accusation of Italy for the European Union and the NATO, which Italy is a part of it, for not supporting Rome when the Italian people most needed carefulness. Spain fighting the pandemic without an expected backup from Germany, where Germany is really could have provided more masks and detergents. It seems highly unlikely in this context that the world will return to the idea of mutually beneficial globalization that defined the early 21st century. And without the incentive to protect the shared economic governance established in the 20th century, those if we don't have the gains that we have seen, those governments will not go back to this globalization, or they might close their border, metaphorically speaking. It will then take enormous self-discipline for political leaders to sustain international cooperation and not retreat from the overall geopolitical competition. Proving to their citizens that they can manage the COVID-19 crisis will buy leaders some political capital, but those who fail will find it hard to resist the temptation to blame others for their failure. And now, as we can see, that the Democrats in the USA are having a breath so that they can benefit for what happened in USA. My third point is China will become the new focus of the economic industries. The COVID-19 pandemic will not fundamentally alter the global economic, and we will not see huge change or major fundamental change, but it will accelerate the change that already began. A move away from USA-centric globalization to a more China-centric globalization. China had proven right in its slow climbing of the economic ladder in the world. A lot of economists were doubtful. We were asking why China is moving so slowly economically. But now everyone is sure that what China did was the right step. And economists are saying the practice by China will be the new practice model for the coming decades. Why will this trend remain? Because the American population has lost faith in globalization and international trade. Free trade agreements are toxic, with or without USA President Donald Trump. By contrast, China has not lost faith. Why? There are deeper historical reasons. Chinese leaders now, they know well that China way of humiliation that occurred to China from 1842 to 1949 was a result of what we say the Western civilization, and now they want to take role in the world, but they are telling the whole world, we will not be tyrant, we will not dominate, we are going to help. And one of the examples is that China is a major contribution in the Copenhagen Airlines. Finally, stability, not profitability. COVID-19 with no doubt will change the mentality of organizations worldwide. Believe me, organizations will start to think differently after COVID-19. Instead of the profit culture that dominates companies worldwide, stability will emerge as a new mission for top managers and board of directors. They will work now on stability. Global supply chains were already coming under fire, both economically and politically. Global supply chains were already coming under fire economically due to rising Chinese labor costs. US President Donald Trump made a trade war, okay? And there was a war also on the technological part in addition to politics. So factories were closing, the economy was facing a lot of challenges worldwide, a lot of recession was occurring, not only because of COVID-19. We had seen a lot of recession in the Gulf, we had seen a lot of recession in Europe, and this was not because of COVID-19. This was something already happening. COVID-19 just accelerated this phenomena. Now, all organizations or big companies will look for stability instead of profitability. Of course, they will care for profitability, but less than before. So the question is, the major question is, when COVID-19 will finish, what will be post-COVID-19, the whole world? Are we going to wear masks for a long time? Economy, how it will be after COVID-19. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad, for sharing this valuable information. And now we are going to hear from Dr. Otaviano Canuto. You're welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. This is a pleasant discussion, and I like very much most of the things that Professor Ahmad has said. In my take will be to a large extent complementary to what he said, in several respects. Of course, it's still unfolding. The coronavirus crisis is still unfolding. But as he aptly outlined, there are a couple of things that we may presume as highly likely for the new normal, post-coronavirus new normal. And I would highlight three of them. One is we will live with everywhere in the world higher levels of debt, both at the public and the private sector sides. On the public sector, this comes obviously from the fact that the coronavirus recession curves accompanying the coronavirus pandemic curves will have called on public sector as the ultimate insurer against catastrophes, and this has been seen everywhere in Lebanon and elsewhere. Attempts to some extent minimize the damage on the income of the poor population because of the policies, the containment policies followed with respect to the pandemics, but also credit lines with some guarantees in order to support the companies that would be feasible under normal circumstances, which have received the shock of the Caesar. This coronavirus crisis is unique vis-a-vis all the precedent ones, the recent, because it combines both supply and demand shocks. And Professor Ahmad is right. The outcome, the global outcomes this year and next year are comparable to the Great Depression of the last century, much worse than any crisis that has happened since then. So we will have, and I say everywhere in the world, higher levels of public debt, and also higher levels of corporate debt, because in many cases, that's going to be the only way by which many companies will survive, if possible. Otherwise, they will bankrupt, and there will be a wave of bankruptcies along the line, given the impact of the downturn in economic activity. A second trait of the post-coronavirus new normal will be, as Professor said, less globalization. It is not necessarily a reversal, a full reversal of globalization, but, and as he also correctly said, it's more an acceleration of a trend that has been there, particularly since the global financial crisis. In many countries, as a reaction to a perception of unfairness in the pool of gains, of economic gains, of efficiency, and so on, stemming from globalization, there has been a pushback, a rise of the nation state intermingling with economic policy making, with protectionism, and so on. And as we saw behind the victory of President Trump and the following trade war that he initiated with China and other countries, as we saw in Brexit, and as we saw in a retreat from full integration in many places. And this, of course, has been aggravated by coronavirus, because now the logic of to be followed by companies, by global value chains, and by nation states will take into account other factors rather than simply efficiency and lower costs. So we will watch, as President Macron has already announced, a government effort in France that will take place, and that's going to be everywhere, attempts by countries to be less dependent on medical equipment, on medicaments to the extent of possible. And so the line of sectors considered strategic will shift. and there will be a policy orientation to let's say, to incentivize local production in some of these global value chains. We don't know as yet how far will this list of strategic sectors will be extended in each country, but definitely the trade-off between efficiency and stability and guarantee of independence or resilience against shocks from abroad will shift. This is leading to less globalization. And a third trend is obviously the one of intensification of digitalization of economic activity and of life in general. With respect to what Professor Ahmad said, I would highlight just a couple of things. On the West-East confrontation, there was one aspect that I would like to add. Clearly, Western countries have shown, let's say, deficiencies in the way by which they have coped with the COVID. But China also did wrong things. China also understated and kept, let's say, suffocated the perception, the early perception of the coronavirus. And definitely things might have been quite different in the unfolding of the crisis if that hadn't happened. Of course, later on, China reacted. China went all the way in the Wuhan province to do whatever it took to control the epidemics. And since it first happened there, China's economy is the one that is, let's say, in the process of economic recovery. But let's be clear, both big powers failed. And what concerns me, and not only me, but many people, is the war of narrative that has been since then, with President Trump trying to blame China, calling the virus Chinese and so on, and with China as well developing a narrative that it's all as well, that we went all okay. Fact of the matter is that both big powers failed. They have failed. And this matters because one of the previous trends that will tend to be exacerbated as well by coronavirus is the dispute between, the frictions between China and US, which go beyond, forget about trading agricultural products, forget about manufacturing. What's going to be at stake, what was already at stake, is a technology race. And the technology race is fundamental because depending on this technology, the consequence go to finance, go to we will have a confrontation between a system based in New York, based on SWIFT, based on a system of payments that is predominant all over the world, with another one that will be based on cryptocurrencies, and which will be fundamental for instance, China having the renminbi as a world currency beyond now. So we're going to watch this fight, and there will be, let's say, the search by each one of these big powers to align countries. And that gets very much complicated. I would highlight a recent speech by the Prime Minister of Singapore, who said the following, literally: don't think Singapore, the small, tiny Singapore, will align with each one of these superpowers. China is the major client of Singapore, but for security reasons, we also have connections with the US. And the same logic of attempting to maintain independence, the battleground, the major battleground for this will be Europe. in the sense that the option whether Europe closes the door to one of those systems will make a potential difference. Hopefully, that's my feeling as a Brazilian. I hope Brazil will be able to make compatible and work with both technology base when it comes to communications. To be seen. One final remark before I lay over is the following. We are facing a paradox, not a paradox, but a moving contradiction. On the one hand, as Professor Ahmad aptly said, we have this rise of the nation state, a tendency toward more inward orientation of countries, of the politics and so on, while at the same time, we have increasing needs of exactly the opposite of global cooperation. Think of all, I say, all major challenges faced by mankind in the near future. The solution to those challenges, they will all demand some sort of a cooperation among countries. Take pandemics, new pandemic. Definitely the climb of confrontation that is taking place during coronavirus, including not only narratives, but also the dispute for scarce medical equipment and so on. This doesn't bode well for, let's say, facing new outbreaks of virus, of pandemics. No one can think that this one is the last one. On the contrary. Take climate change. There is no way to cope efficiently with climate change if we don't have most countries on board of this fight. With some degree of cooperation, with some degree of joint coordination of efforts, so as to avoid beggar my neighbor policies or countries piggybacking on the efforts of others. And in this regard, we need things like the Paris Agreement, which has unfortunately been left aside by President Trump. But with subnational entities and the private sector in the US still committed to it. So climate change will need more globalization, more globalized efforts. Cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, the fight against terrorism. All this will demand more degrees of cooperation. So this idea that, you know, we might have the retreat of governments into national borders may not bode well for these global channels. To a large extent, Professor Ahmad said something quite important about the Eurozone. The Eurozone will be a frontier area in which this moving contradiction will be tested. As I said, there will be a different pace all over the world with higher public debt. Think of Italy, Spain, and other Eurozone countries, which were already facing dire straits in their public finance, and things will be definitely worse after coronavirus. And more than ever, they will need some sort of a debt mutualization in the region. And let's see how it is that Germany and other major surplus countries behave with respect to that need of debt mutualization. Otherwise, we might watch new rounds of Eurozone crisis. But the major point that I would like to leave on is that the confrontation West versus East, or in a narrow sense, between China and US, will be defined on the technology grounds, and it is not a fait accompli. It's not something that is already, let's say, definitely with a response. A final point, Professor Ahmad. Again, let me quote Singapore again. Some years ago, I guess around 10 years, I watched an interview with Charlie Rose of former President, Prime Minister Lee Kuan-yew. And he was asked, Charlie Rose asked him, will China be the next Asian? And his answer was the following. He, who voted with Deng Xiaoping before implementing his project. And Deng Xiaoping used Singapore as, let's say, a test of opening the economy that was so successful that helped Deng Xiaoping to take the courage and make the reforms that led China what it is now. Okay, so the one answer was the following: China has a major difficulty to become an hegemon. To become an hegemon, the others must trust, must feel, let's say, protected by the hegemon, as to some extent the U.S. did with the Vietnamese that lost the war and went back to the U.S. And according to the to the great Lee Kuan-yew, China still is to acquire that confidence by the rest of the world. There is today less trust, I would say, in most countries that I know, in China than in the US. Of course, the US may depending on the behavior of what comes after President Trump, may debase that trust, yes. But the issue of trusting is fundamental to win the battle of hearts and minds for a country to become an hegemon. And this is not quite clear now. It's something that will have to be made on the construction, on the road. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Otaviano, for your speech. I would like to pass the mic to Ms. Lawyer Sandrella Merhej. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the interesting presentation you have presented, and thank you for giving me the chance to be with you. Actually, I would like to give a brief intervention. I agree with what was already told regarding the negative impacts of the COVID-19 regarding the public debts and the private debts and negative impact on globalization, the rise of digital economy, and the big role of e-commerces and the e-commerce and this coming decade, if we can say. But I would like to highlight on a point. I think that the positive impact of COVID-19 will be in the new forms of international treaties and new forms of international agreements. Well, so the globalization will be shifted, in my point of view, regarding the legal status of the world. I think that new treaties and new agreements will be in the coming next years a must for most countries, especially for China, for Japan, for the East and for the West, as well as the Middle East. And these treaties are highlighted on three major issues regarding public health, regarding trade, and regarding, as we can say, even military status for some cooperation among countries. I think the COVID-19 negative impact is not only on a social aspect as well as it is on defense for some countries, and I mean that if really the global recession will be the form of life in the coming next years, this will not keep the security and the general security of the world safe as somehow it is like now in some countries, especially in the Middle East and in the East as well, among US and China, or US and Iran, or whatever. So I guess that COVID-19 will turn the world into a new form of new parties doing some form of defense aspect to try to avoid what will the economy aspect be on the political situation, as well on the military situation, as on the individual also form of life for some private sectors. I think the World Bank is playing now a role regarding how the World Bank will be helping countries to overpass this public debts upcoming due to coronavirus. This is why the major issue now, I want to ask Mr. Otaviano about it, is the World Bank is usually asked about kind of reforms, kind of reforms in the country to be able to give or to help countries asking for the World Bank help. How this will be available due to this to this global recession, as you were mentioning, and how will the World Bank will be able to help people, to help countries and government that they have no positive, or they don't have any new form of agreements with our countries to be able to reform or to fight the deficit in their countries.
Can I then try to answer, give an answer to Sandrella, straightforward? Sandrella, the World Bank has been, and I recently retired, so I'm very much well up to date with how things have been evolving there and at the IMF. There has been an extraordinary effort by the World Bank to simplify procedures, to revamp the portfolios of the country so as to delocate commitments towards health expenditures and so on. Yes, but the size is not enough to expect the World Bank to save the developing world. We're talking about magnitudes. The IMF as well. The IMF has did a big effort to boost the emergency funding lines. The IMF answered positively to most of more than 100 requests by countries to speed up access to emergency. But this is, in the case of the IMF, is short-term money. Is to face the immediate needs of cash. Whereas the money from the World Bank, which is lending, long-term lending, unfortunately, it doesn't have the size, the capacity to cope with the magnitude of the debt. You know where you have the bulk of the debt in many parts of the world today is with China. And we will have, let's say, on the official side, on the credit provided by governments, the G20 countries, including China and US and everybody else, postponed the debt service of the poor countries for this year. But the amount of debt is still there. It is still accruing interest rates and so on. So next year and later, in the post-coronavirus moment, we will have, let's say, the situation of indebtedness of most poor countries back. And a key agent in that regard will be China, because that's where most of the debt of African, sub-Saharan African poor countries, for instance, is. So we do have a problem with the indebtedness, particularly of the poor countries, but the multilateral institutions don't have the let's say, the capacity to solve this. We will watch, most likely, I would say, is what many people expect, down the road, many poor countries asking for debt restructuring, some sort of debt distress, and some debt renegotiation. That's, in a nutshell, what these institutions can do. It's not the same as it was after World War II, when these Bretton Woods institutions, they were created and they had the capacity and they have the size enough to make a huge difference. Nowadays, since particularly the 80s and the financial opening of southern countries, the magnitude of both institutions ceased to be, let's say, enough to substitute, to replace the market. And by the way, and this applies even if we extend this, not only the World Bank, IMF are no longer, particularly the World Bank is no longer the only kid in the block. Now you have not only the regional development banks, but also you have the New Development Bank, you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, led by China, you have other institutions, Islamic Development Bank, and so on. But if you add up them all, they are not large enough to, let's say, to replace and take care of the existing pending public debt problem in developing, public and external debt problem in one final thing. I have written a couple of pieces on explaining why poor countries or developing countries in general have faced a perfect storm with the coronavirus. Besides the inner difficulties for developing countries to fight the pandemics, number of people living in slums, degree of informality in the labor market, and so on. On top of that, the developing countries have been hit by financial shocks coming from the advanced economies, by commodity price shocks, by a decline in tourism, which is quite important to many developing countries, and remittance. The World Bank estimated, forecast a decline of $100 billion of remittance this year. And in the case of some countries, I think of Haiti. In Haiti, more than a third of the GDP is comprised by remittance. So this is really a disaster. The magnitude is tremendous.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I thank you. And I asked you this question just to emphasize on a point. I think that the only, or maybe the positive effect of the global corona virus, COVID-19, will be on international financial institutes, the one you have mentioned. And actually, we're living in a corporatocracy world. And we all know that the big financial institutions in the world are kind of running this global economy. And due to this public global debts and private debts in the private sectors, the the role of World Bank and other international institutions will be higher than it was previously, before or now. So I don't know if you agree with me, but I think COVID-19 is not having a bad influence on international financial institute. Is it true, the analysis that says that usually World Bank or other financial institutions usually don't wait for poor countries to really pay back the debts? So sorry for being so much honest, but this is a view, and as a lawyer, I need to know your answer about this.
Right. Look, Sandrella, maybe I wasn't clear. These institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, don't have the size, the capacity to replace the other flows of credit. I will give an example. Take the case of Brazil. The World Bank lends roughly something like $1 billion per year. The public debt that is rolled over, the flows of a rollover of the public debt in Brazil every year get close to $100 billion. And countries like Brazil and many others, they are already at the top of the capacity of lending that the World Bank has. So World Bank and IMF, they add value, particularly sometimes in policy advice, in playing what I used to call in my times there, it's hummingbird role. That is to say, pollinizing knowledge, learning experience here and there, with some little money and so on. But don't count on them as having money, capital enough to comply with that function. These institutions have limits. As I said, the IMF can, let's say, provide very easily this year $1 trillion, up to $1 trillion in credit, whereas the short-term needs of finance, balance of payments finance of developing countries have been estimated in something close to $2.5 trillion. The World Bank can lend roughly something close to $25 billion per year. Well, the needs of finance of poor countries, of paying the service and rolling over the debt, go something close to 500 billions to the least. It's a matter of size, I'm saying. But they cannot entirely save the developing world. Of course, the IDA and other kinds of credit may become particularly relevant depending on the country case. If in the case of countries that have not necessarily relied on external finance or which are entitled to development finance on concessional terms for several reasons and so on, these institutions are the only source of finance, as well as the bilateral. But to most developing countries, even if the World Bank wanted to, let's say, be there, it doesn't have the size enough for that. They are helpful, but they cannot save the day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lawyer Sandrella, for your speech and for this nice debate with Dr. Otaviano. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to show a video by Lord Alexander Carlile, who has insisted to present his video. He recorded the video. Now I will share it.
Hello, I'm Alex Carlile. I'm speaking to you from London. I'm very sorry not to be with you in life, as it were, during this seminar. I had intended to be there, and for reasons connected with unavoidable political demands, I'm not able to be. I'm honoured to have been asked to join with you, the participants, in this meeting. If you have any questions of me, then please will you email them to Ahmad, and I will attempt to answer them by email in the days that follow. I've been asked to make some comments about the effect of COVID-19 on the world order. I'm going to start by saying something that is painfully obvious. The effect on the world order will be profound. I'm a former member of the House of Commons, an MP in the UK, and I'm now a member of the House of Lords. In almost every text, every email, every document that I've seen since March, the effect of COVID-19 on the world order is being discussed, usually with a series of question marks at the end of the discussion. Let me give you some examples of the most obvious effects on the world order. Let's start with a really big issue, which is being iterated this very day and in recent days as the situation changes, and that is the relationship with China. The relationship between the United States and China is the worst it has been since the Korean War, and that is obviously worrying. The People's Congress has tried to be compromising, surprisingly compromising, in the press statements it's issued as the end of the Congress approaches. The starting point for this is the way in which coronavirus spread around the world. Unsurprising, Mr. Trump, who thinks and speaks in headlines, not always entirely consistent with one another, from day to day, even from hour to hour, is using that as a stick with which to beat China. And that's perfectly reasonable because plainly we have not been able to examine the genesis of this issue and how it has spread around the world. The Chinese are going to have to acquiesce in some form of independent inquiry, and it cannot be done through the World Health Organization because of the closeness there has been between the World Health Organization and certain of its leading figures and China in the months before COVID-19 commenced and started to spread. Connected with the COVID-19 issue in China is the whole question of Huawei having a part in communication systems in countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, and other countries which are part of our alliance, particularly with those countries whose intelligence is shared through what is known as the Five Eyes organization. Technical advice before COVID-19 was that certain aspects of the apologies for that technical glitch. This is the second part of my comments. I was discussing Huawei. There is absolutely no doubt that a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is that countries like the United Kingdom will be more reluctant to use Huawei components in national security communications, and that will filter through to other communications. I'm aware of at least one other issue in which serious questions are being asked as to whether non-Huawei Chinese components should be included in a communications business. So there is going to be a distancing from China. Supply chains are going to be affected very significantly by the events of COVID-19. Next issue. How is COVID-19 going to affect other world politics? Well, let's look at the politics of the Gulf region. The effect of COVID-19 on Iran has been much greater than the Iranian government has been prepared to accept. It's had a huge effect on Iran. There have been tens and tens of thousands of deaths that they have not admitted to. The Iranian economy is in very serious trouble. Their saber rattling barely conceals the problems they have. The supreme leader is old and not in particularly good health, and there's a succession battle going on. And the effect of the politics of Iran vibrates across the whole Middle East region. There's also the question of the durability of the current regime in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman is not the world's favorite statesman. I suspect that if he were to come to London, there would be vehement demonstrations in the streets against him. Although the UK government, the US government have to maintain at the moment good relations with Saudi Arabia, they're being very much at arm's length. So we have two substantial countries in that region which are under world political and diplomatic attrition. That is going to affect the results of COVID-19. Then there's the politics of the United States of America. I've already said a few words about Donald Trump. In the United Kingdom, people find it difficult to believe that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And certainly relationships are, again, at arm's length. The current British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, looks as though he'll be in office for a considerable time. He is flexible enough to be able to make good relations with a new American president if Mr. Biden is elected. But there is a problem about Mr. Biden's election because he's somewhat accident prone. The elections are looking tight, although Biden looks like the favorite if you do the detailed analysis, as I have done with colleagues, of the current voting intentions in the key battleground states in the United States of America. So I expect Biden to be elected on balance, but I wouldn't be confident about it. This leads to a considerable amount of uncertainty about the US approach to politics in key areas around the world, and not least towards China. The next issue is Russia. It is absolutely clear that Russia has a very serious COVID-19 problem. This has, to an extent, undermined the authority of Mr. Putin. My own view is that Mr. Putin will remain in power. He'll consolidate his power so far as he feels he needs to, and probably there will be a degree of stability there in political terms. However, leading on to the next major issue, which is the price of oil, the price of oil is not going to rebound quickly enough to support the Russian economy to the extent of the support it needs. There is also going to be in the European Union, in the United Kingdom, in the United States of America, and in various other important countries, a move away from the use of oil, and indeed, where possible, even from the use of gas, towards technology which is climate change compatible. I don't know if listeners know this, but in the United Kingdom, during the pandemic lockdown, there have been periods where only renewable sources were being used to power the electricity grid. There will be a large demand for a move away from the traditional power station systems, and that is going to continue at an accelerated pace under what I call the ill wind principle. You know the saying, an ill wind does nobody any good. Well, actually, under the ill wind principle, a great deal of good, it would be said, has been done to climate change supporters, and I expect that to reverberate permanently through the politics of countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, the United States, and also some quite important smaller countries like Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, and so on. Then there is the South America. COVID-19 is still having dramatic effects in South America. The Brazilian political situation is critical. The situation in South America is more critical than in Africa, so it would appear, probably because of the physical age profile of the average citizen of African countries as compared with, say, South American or European countries. So COVID-19 is having a major impact, and I've just outlined some of the areas in which that is arising. Then there's the issue of the global economies. The United Kingdom actually provides quite a good snapshot. A conservative government has been forced to take measures which no conservative government would ever have taken voluntarily. So it is recognized that higher taxpayers will continue to pay higher tax. It is recognized that the government has had to fund the earnings, the weekly earnings, the monthly earnings of a very large slice of the population. Something like 60% of the population in one way or another is now dependent on government subsidies of their earnings. It's recognized that even professional people like lawyers, particularly those who are involved in publicly funded work, that is to say, criminal law and family law, have had to be given special support. Small businesses, which make a very significant part of the economies of the Western developed world, are in great difficulties. Just as I am running a small consultancy, speaking to you from my office at home, I'm not able to go into my office in central London. So offices all over central London are standing empty as we speak. That is likely to have a very significant effect on the price of commercial property in London, because people will change their working habits after this. More of us will be doing exactly what I'm doing, talking to friends across the world from the comfort of our own homes, the peace of our own homes. Right across the world, therefore, economies are going to go through attrition. There will be depression. We will emerge from that depression because there's going to be a lot of catching up to do, and that will happen apace. Hairdressers will be in enormous demand when they're able to reopen. Restaurants will be having their late summer or early autumn opening specials, to which regular clients will be invited. I received a discount offer from one of London's best restaurants just an hour or so ago by email. So we're going to have a period of readjustment. And I think the importance of that economic readjustment is twofold. First of all, we're going to have to recognize that economies are artificial. They're artifices. Money is not something that grows on trees or is cultivated in fields. Money can be created, and it has been created. The Bank of England has been extraordinarily versatile in recent weeks by issuing bonds that produce negative returns, but produce the certainty of cash at least remaining intact over a lengthy period. So I do believe that quantitative easing, the issuing of money that didn't exist in the past on a national and international basis, is bound to happen, and that will help the economies of the world to recover perhaps rather more quickly than previously was believed to be likely. I think economic panic is actually off the agenda now in most reasonably well-run countries, and they are the countries that support the economies of those countries that are not particularly well run. I think there is going to be more subjective internal judgment by governments and parliaments of where investments come from. For example, there is an attempt at the moment by a Saudi Arabian interest to buy one of the United Kingdom's major football clubs, Newcastle United. It's been examined with greater care than I have ever known in all my years of following that great sport, and probably will not go through. That kind of scrutiny will be applied to property deals, it will be applied to retail deals, and in particular, it's going to be applied to the ownership of infrastructure, particularly the power industry and other infrastructure projects like the building of railways, the building of roads. And there will be in all major economies a focus on doing it from home, doing it with our own created money, doing it with our own enterprises, or at least ensuring that foreign investors are not able to obtain significant control over British economic assets and those of other countries, which can be compared with the United Kingdom. So I think the consequence of that is that there is going to be less unfettered capitalism and more societal and political control of the economic development of countries as we emerge from COVID-19. It's also going to affect overseas aid. The United Kingdom maintains its international obligations with overseas aid and will continue to do so. But that begs the question. The important question is how that aid is used. In the past, we've been relatively relaxed in the UK about its use. Some of it has been bilateral, some of it has been multilateral. Some multilateral agencies have been under pressure for other reasons, non-economic. I am pretty sure now that the use of overseas aid will be carefully controlled and will be done through international organizations so far as possible. However, those international organizations are going to have to improve their performance. That includes the World Health Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF, the United Nations generally, and we are going to be looking for leadership to people who have the greatest experience in the objective analysis of need around the world. What I'm really saying is I think the focus is going to be on hunger, on health, and on creating the means of production in countries to which handouts have been given of previously produced goods in the past. So that leads to the conclusion that there are going to be incredible challenges of an economic and political nature in the world as a result of COVID-19. And it all sounds pretty bad. Is it all bad? Well, I'm not so sure. I think that there will be a reduction in military tensions in certain parts of the world, but there are some very key places. Let's start with the Straits of Hormuz. I believe that economic attrition in both Saudi Arabia and Iran and the concerns of the Gulf states will mean that the Straits of Hormuz will retain their importance. The military powers of the world, including NATO and the United States and the United Kingdom, particularly the Royal Navy, will do everything they possibly can to keep the Straits of Hormuz open and unaffected by hostility. There is then the question of China. China has been flexing its muscles around the South China Sea. Taiwan feels under threat. Events in recent days in Hong Kong have attracted an enormous amount of criticism. However, that said, what is emerging from the People's Congress currently ending is that the Chinese do not want to get involved in a heavy Cold War. There's a certain amount of ritual in what they do in relation to Taiwan. It's gone on for a very long time. The Chinese, in my judgment, know that any direct threat from For example, further economic sanctions that affect Taiwan would cause them immense trouble and could be very damaging to people in China. And I think the result of COVID-19 is going to help to reduce that tension. Equally in Europe, although the Russians from time to time are quite provocative, for example, by their placement of submarines in the North Sea, nevertheless, I do not believe that Mr. Putin and his advisors really want to return to the Cold War mentality, and that is not something that NATO or its member states want. There is an issue about Turkey and its relationship with NATO, of which it's a valued member. President Erdogan has perhaps skillfully been playing one interest against another. The situation in Turkey will be watched with anxious scrutiny by observers, particularly diplomats around the world, but there will be a significant effort to ensure that Turkey remains both very much part of NATO and a good friend to other countries which have benefited from the size of Turkey, its ability to produce manufactured goods cheap, for example, personal protective equipment, provided the quality is properly controlled, and it's also its potential, which is enormous, for the leisure trade, and especially for holiday makers. Those of us who have enjoyed our holidays from time to time in Turkey want to go back there and see the wonders of that country and enjoy the hospitality of that nation. And I think now, just taking Turkey as an example, there will be a move towards normalization. President Erdogan's succession is a live issue, but we will have to watch that with great care. But I do not see it as being a major international issue in the future. Israel presents difficulties. In my personal view, this is only a view stated by one politically involved individual in the United Kingdom, it's a mistake to move towards annexation. That said, I have a strong suspicion on the evidence we've seen so far that any annexations will be of the smallest settlements and not of the larger settlements. The danger of a breakdown in tense but reasonably cordial relations in that part of the world is very serious. The position of Jordan is crucial in this. And that leads me to a discussion of terrorism. I could give you a detailed account, because I have it on my desk now, of the number of terrorism events which have occurred or been attempted since the beginning of March during the COVID-19 experience. It's worrying. It is absolutely clear that terrorists and terrorist organizations have been using some religious heresies, some political arguments, some just simply opportunistic actions to argue that COVID-19 is a judgment of the Almighty and it's all that the infidels in the West deserve, and so on. I don't think any sensible person takes any of those threats seriously, but we have to take seriously the consequences if it means that people are being encouraged to take part in low-level terrorist actions around the world. And of course, the place that's threatened the most by terrorism is the area in the Middle East, where most terrorist organizations have their foundations and their various forms of headquarters. So the terrorist threat, on which I have spent much of the last 20 years as an expert in terrorist issues and as the United Kingdom's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation from 2001 to 2011, leads me to the conclusion that we have to be as vigilant as ever. There is a danger that people in the West will say, well, look at the number of people, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've been killed by COVID-19. Terrorists have killed much smaller numbers of people. It's a much smaller issue. Fewer people die in road accidents. More people die in road accidents than in terrorism events, and therefore we should reduce its primacy in the political agendas of Western countries. That would be a mistake. Whenever terrorism events take place in London or Paris or any other major city in the West, it has a hugely significant effect on the political disposition of the country where it's occurred. We have to remain vigilant to terrorism. I do hope, though, that the terrorism activities and ambitions which have been expressed in the COVID-19 pandemic will be frowned upon and rejected by governments around the world. And I would say to any government that has a connection with terrorists, whether it's in the West or in the Middle East or in the Gulf or anywhere else in the world, in Africa, in South Asia, it's a mistake internationally. It's bad for your reputation. It's very foolish to give any encouragement to terrorism. Terrorists have to be prevented, they have to be detected, they have to be prosecuted wherever they are, and any government that has any connection with terrorist organizations should be ashamed of itself. That is the view that's held in America. It's the view that's held in Western Europe, whether the countries concerned are members of the EU or not. So I think that has to be my closing message in this talk, that terrorism is still alive and unfortunately rather too well, and that part of the post-COVID-19 political dispensation and discussion should be the determination that terrorism should be reduced and should not be allowed to increase or to be protected. Terrorism is not a legitimate use of political power. I hope those few thoughts have been of some assistance to you. Again, I apologize for not actually being with you today, and I hope that you'll have a fruitful discussion, and I look forward to receiving questions over the coming days. Thank you very much, and from London, I'm now signing off. Goodbye.
We'd like to thank Lord Alexander Carlile for his speech as well. I'd like now to ask my colleague Dana Al-Hajjar to take the lead through the Q&A. Please, Dana.
Thank you, Ahmad. COVID-19, this microscopic organism has turned the world upside down and has imposed social, economic, political, and professional guidelines. The quick spreading ability of this virus has caused thousands of deaths and has forced governments to take the lockdown decision in order to prevent any health catastrophe. Such decision will definitely not pass silently. In fact, this pandemic is considered an earthquake shaking the world's economy. Sure, we will emerge from this pandemic, but the real challenge is to take the right decision at the right time. Here comes the importance of this webinar, which shed the light on the potential situation based on experts' analysis and expectations. However, the question that should be asked, will the world we behold on the other side of this crisis will be similar to the one we have known? By this question, we introduce the Q&A session, during which our audience will have the opportunity to share their inquiries with our prestigious panelists. Kindly, before asking any question, introduce yourself and tell to whom the question is addressed. The first question will be received from Ms. Ala Asa.
Mr. Otaviano.
Yes, please.
Okay, to what extent can the government central bank influence the macroeconomy?
Central banks? Look, central banks can go to some extent in avoiding that financial stress, become a full financial crisis. this is a lesson learned from the Great Depression. Today, we understand clearly, we have known this for some time, that we had the Great Depression because after the crash of the stock market in '29, we had a wave of defaults and a wave of bankruptcies that transmitted the downfall of the stock market into the real economy, and then we had the Great Depression. This lesson has been learned, and it was implemented after the global financial crisis. That's why the Federal Reserve Bank implemented went way beyond conventional monetary policy by developing the quantitative easing approach, which is having the central bank buying assets and so providing liquidity and so on. And also it was followed in the Eurozone. Frankly, Japan had already started implementing these policies. And we saw recently, in March, how the Federal Reserve Bank went all the way with a new round of quantitative easing, even going beyond the previous experience. When the Federal Reserve Bank created special lines of credit to buy commercial papers to go beyond the banks, because the financial intermediation has been developed since the global financial crisis, not through banks, but through non-banking financial institutions. So the Federal Reserve Bank extended its toolbox, and it went all the way to provide liquidity. In doing so, it avoided the transmission of the shock in March to the rest of the economy, married to the Federal Reserve Bank. But at the same time, this is only part of the story. This is not enough to ring-fence the economy from the downturn tendency. And that's why the president of the Federal Reserve Bank, the governor, Jeremy Powell, recently gave a very important speech highlighting how the fiscal policy side must be there as well. Monetary policy cannot do it by itself. One has to have the combination of fiscal and monetary policies. So the Fed has done its job, like the European Central Bank is trying to do it. But unless we have, let's say, convergent policies on the fiscal side, and in the case of Europe, it will have to be some sort of a mutualization of debt issuance. Unless we have more, let's say, coordinated and convergent fiscal policy, the action by the monetary policy is not enough to countervail the downward trends.
Thank you, Dr. Canuto, for your answer. Now we have a question from Mr. Luaya Musa. Question is for Ms. Sandrella. What are your views of Lebanon post COVID-19?
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, I believe that Lebanon post to COVID-19 will be exactly as it was before COVID-19. As you already know, we Lebanese, we are facing a very critical situation regarding the economic situation, regarding the social situation, and now more than 50% of Lebanese citizens are on poverty. And I don't think that the government right now is setting an economic plan, because as you know, we are asking from the IMF a kind of financial help for the situation we face, especially the big public debts. And COVID-19, I think it's not the basic reason for this effect we are facing now. And I think the situation in Lebanon will be worse because there's no really any effective economic plan to go through into a productive economy and to find out a way even to pay our debts if we are going to be having more public debt. So the situation is very critical. I think the solidarity of Lebanese citizens must be our priority in this coming the upcoming time, because we need to support each other as much as we can, and we need to work harder into finding kind of بالعربي بنقولها اكتفاء ذاتي, because I don't think that countries around are able to help Lebanon in financial or in economic. We need to find new ways for our international trade. We need to move and to shift more into the east, and to find, as I mentioned before, find new ways to do kind of international trade treaties with countries that we were previously not opened up enough with them.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sandrella. There is another question from Ms. Ala Asaf, which is, what is the impact of the health crisis on banking stability? And she would like to know your opinions as well as Dr. Otaviano's opinion.
My opinion about the
impact of the crisis on the banking stability.
The effect of the crisis on the banking stability?
Yes, please.
Actually, we don't have any banking stability meanwhile in Lebanon. The banking sector is really in danger, and this is really bad, because as we all know that the banking sector was fundamental for the economy in Lebanon and for its international status. So we were really counting on our banking services for the growth of the economy, and now this the banking sector is really facing a big crisis in two ways. First, I think the confidence in this sector is not as it used to be from the Lebanese citizen as well as from the international world. Second, we have a crisis regarding the dollars and the Lebanese pound, and I don't think that there is any way to rescue and to find out how to overcome this crisis. COVID-19 maybe is having a big impact on other industrial countries and countries already that has oil sectors or whatever. But regarding countries like Lebanon, yes, it has some kind of negative impact on our social life, on our regular daily life, but it's not the basic reason for the recession we're facing, not the basic reason for our public debt. And I want to emphasize also on a note, all international monetary or financial institution as World Bank or IMF or whatever, they always emphasize on the importance of a new fiscal policy. Actually, in countries like Lebanon, facing this high deficit and this high public debt, and with poverty rising up, with people without work losing their work, and even everything is shifting into bad sides. I don't know how fiscal policies are going to be really effective in Lebanon and to rescue the economy, or to be able to pay our debts, or to rise up the confidence in Lebanese economy, and also to gain the confidence of IMF or World Bank or other international institution. So I think we are facing a very critical economic and social situation. We have to not rely on only on asking help from international institutions like IMF or World Bank or whatever. We have to find a way to shift into new treaties with new countries in the East and in the Arab region.
Thank you for your answer, and hope to find a solution to get out of this problem soon. Now, Dr. Otaviano, can you give us your opinion?
Yes. Trying to be complementary to Sandrella. First, we are living through, including Lebanon and everywhere else, a situation of catastrophe. And it's fully understandable that in situations of a catastrophe, any country has to suspend the conditions, the typical rules regarding fiscal policy that are to prevail in normal circumstances. To a large extent, the pandemics are like war situation. And this is fully understood by everyone, and this is happening all over the world. So as of now, as of today, let's say there would be no crazy person in the world to suggest the Lebanese government or any government to not spend, to not do whatever it takes to save lives and to sustain the minimum conditions of the economy. There is always, of course, a discussion, a potential to choose, to define more cost-effective ways of using that fiscal space, trying to do things in a way that maximize the results vis-a-vis the cost. There is also a side aspect, which is, to the extent possible, the country may give signals that after the period of the catastrophe, that will pursue the appropriate fiscal policies under the new circumstance. So there's no issue with a fiscal policy under circumstances of catastrophe as we are. Keeping in mind that something must be said about how the country needs to proceed later on. And by the way, we're gonna see a world in which taxes will have to rise, because each and every country is undergoing this increased indebtedness. We'll have to find ways to raise taxes, particularly on corporates and or in wealthier people. That's going to be a phenomenon all over the world. The second topic is on banks. In the advanced economies, that's not where the problem is now. After the global financial crisis, due to regulations, stiff regulations that were implemented on banking, because the banks were at the core of the global financial crisis, the over leverage, the indirect exposure to real estate bubbles and so on. After all, it was the downfall of the Lehman Brothers that led to the global financial crisis. So the banks have been subject to very stiff rules against impeding them to do what they did before, over leverage and so on. And also the banks themselves adopted strategies of looking for lower degrees of leverage and so on. So the whole, let's say, dynamism of financial flows in advanced economies, particularly in the US, after the global financial crisis, took place at the non-banking financial institutions, mutual funds, institutional investors, which profited from from the low interest rates to leverage themselves to become the new financial intermediaries. So that's where the concern is. We have nowadays in all these advanced economies a high degree of corporate leverage, of corporate vulnerability to debt, and as well as a hyper leverage of institutional investors and so on. That's why the Federal Reserve Bank, instead of acting only on banks, the Federal Reserve Bank had to create new lines of liquidity support directly to those non-banking financial intermediaries. But as far as the banking system is concerned, that's not where the vulnerabilities are in case of advanced economies.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question. What is the impact of this crisis on the global economy? Dr. Otaviano?
Well, the effect as measured by GDP per capita will be so deep that the following will happen. The IMF last month presented its forecast during the first ever virtual spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank. And in each one of these meetings, the IMF team comes with a forecast about the global economy. And the ones presented by the IMF and the World Bank last month, they have been recognized by these institutions informally as very optimistic. Those But since even those optimistic forecasts of last month particularly in the case of most developing countries, with some recovery next year, 21. But even with the recovery next year, the forecast next month, which was optimistic, pointed to GDP per capita at the end of next year, still lower than the end of last year. So during 2020 and 2021, the GDP, the global GDP per capita will be lower, decline vis-a-vis the past. Just to give an idea of, and this including even China, for instance. China was expected to grow something close to 6% in January by the IMF, 5.9%. And now the forecast is pointing, the most optimistic, an increase of 1% this year. Even for the first time in many years, the Congress of the party in China opted for not providing any forecast of GDP growth, just to give an idea of how, let's say, cautious they were with predictions. India will at most have something minus 3.5. And this is the estimate based on the optimistic scenario of last month. Fact is that the coronavirus crisis will be one event. It's not in the sense that the coronavirus cannot stay in the world forever. One way or another, even if no vaccines come very soon, even if the coronavirus has some outbreaks, like we had with the flu pandemic in the last century that lasted from 1918 to 1920. It's a one-shot event, but it is very deep while it lasts. And therefore, the global economy is facing dire conditions this year and next year in the way that I said. There will be an end, but the result will be terrible. There are several possible shapes of the recovery. Definitely the most optimistic one was, let's say, some people had by January or February, thinking only on China, of a V as a V. That is a downfall and then a steep recovery. Forget about it. So the most optimistic scenarios nowadays, they all look at the shape of the recovery as something like an U. That is a steep downfall, then sometime down, and then a recovery. If we have other outbreaks of the coronavirus, if, for instance, the opening happens too soon, which is always a risk, as it happened in the flu pandemic of 1920, then we might have a W. And if the damage left by the coronavirus is, let's say, durable, then we might have a recovery that looks like an L. That's the most pessimistic scenario. That is, let me try to do it. The economy was going like this, then it falls, and it starts, when the recovery comes, it comes without, let's say, getting back what it lost. So it's an L. So there, one can come with an ABC of shapes of coronavirus recovery curves. But definitely, while it lasts, that is to say, the moment of the decline is as deep as I described. And I was at a webinar beginning of this week with a former colleague from the IMF, the guy responsible for some of the forecasts of the IMF. And I poked him during the debate, and he was obliged to recognize that the IMF team itself is already, let's say, reviewing downward the forecast. Next month, we're going to have a new update of the IMF forecast, and definitely from what he had to confess, the figures will come even worse than the ones of last month.
Thank you for your answer, and hope to emerge from this crisis with less catastrophic results. Now we have a question from my colleague Ahmad. Please, Ahmad.
Thank you, Dana. I have a question to lawyer Sandrella, please. You have mentioned that there's a positive impact by creating new treaties and agreements. If I would think about the economy while it's slowing down, will the governments be issuing any kinds of contracts, or are they going to spend on people while the unemployment is rising and we are seeing slowness in the economies everywhere? So what do you think about it, please?
Thank you for your question. Actually, I believe that also some forces in the world are really taking advantage from the COVID-19 to trying to implement their financial or their economic or their trade orders to the world. This is why I said that international new treaties and international new agreements must be done as a strategy, as a way in the strategy of recovering and rescuing the economy of the country. Your question was, how am I seeing that this will be possible to be done if the government is what?
If the government is going to spend on people, or they will issue some kind of funds, because we have seen unemployment is rising day after day, and the economy is very slowing down, and there is still time that they will start reopening again.
Yes, but I didn't say that these treaties gonna include fiscal fiscal orders on people, or maybe these treaties will be a kind of cooperation in international trade, or kind of cooperation in production, or cooperation in special kind of free trade among some sources. I didn't say that these treaties must be the result of these treaties or agreements. The people or the citizens should be involved in how to implement them, or how to pay for their debts. These treaties must be away from, as well as the international monetary institutions are maybe important in this kind of crisis, but I said we should not rely on them completely and find new treaties. And these treaties in economy and trade, and maybe also in defense strategies. And we should also not forget that these forces trying to take advantage from COVID-19, for example, are implementing kind of economic sanctions and kind of financial sanctions on bank sectors, on governments, on public sector, on private sector, on some individuals. So we should not be staying and watching what is happening from international forces. We have to create also our own national force and international force, and the treaties and international agreements are the way.
Thank you. I have another question for Dr. Otaviano. Doctor, you have mentioned that there is a need for fight against terrorism, and there's a focus on cybersecurity. There's a big role for technology post the COVID-19. I would like if you can shed the light more about this, please.
Great. Thank you for the question. Yes, I mentioned cybersecurity and I mentioned terrorism as illustrations, examples of problems faced by mind that will demand some sort of cooperation, some sort of coordination among many countries in order to be feasible to do it. Because if you don't have, let's say, negotiation and harmonization of standards, if you don't have negotiation and harmonization of rules, of information sharing and so on, there will be loopholes that can be appropriated and used by either those who use cyber terrorism or sheer terrorism itself. So there has to be very regular exchange of information. And this applies to the whole range of issues. Let's give an example of tax. Since I mentioned tax, that raising taxes will be a common issue in most countries that are facing an increase in the deficits. In most countries, don't count on cutting expenditures, government spending in the future, because many countries have gone through austerity measures in the last decade. In most countries, the demographic change is leading to the need of higher government spending with health, and coronavirus has demonstrated the need to spend more on public health, on hospital capacity, and so on. So there will be a pressure towards higher spending. And this will only be possible if countries raise taxes which will have to be on corporates or on personal personal income. Now, no country individually will be able to do this without some sort of coordination. if you start lifting corporate taxes in one country, then immediately there will be capital flight. There will be the use of loopholes for the companies to shift their profits to another country. And we've been seeing this in the last 40 years. A decline in corporate tax rates, a dispute, a fiscal war between Europe and the US, or Brazil, Argentina. So unless most countries get together to some rules, to some coordination, to tighten the loopholes and avoid the refugee of capital into fiscal havens, they will all lose. They will all be doomed to fail. And this applies to I illustrated the taxes, but this applies to cybersecurity. This applies to anti-terrorism efforts and so on. It's either there is a degree of cooperation or the whole world is doomed to fail in facing these issues.
Okay, we have received the last question from Alejandro Lara to Dr. Otaviano as well. Putting the COVID-related negativity stuff on the side, what is the best advice or approach to move forward thinking out of the box to be better and more productive?
Well, thinking out of the box. Definitely two things come to my mind. First, we need to upgrade the level of information collection regarding the health and the situation of individual citizens. In the future, let's say, make sure that we have availability of tests. Why it is that Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, China succeeded so well, and Germany as well, And because of early action, include, I don't know very much, I'm not very up to date with Lebanon, but I will also include Mongolia as a successful case. In the successful case, you have tests, and then contact tracing. That's how Singapore was able to let's say, locate someone infected, put the person aside, and also demand the contacts that had been collected through the electronic means to stay at home and so on. That's how Singapore, Taiwan, China, and South Korea were able to do selective social distancing, selective policies, minimizing, therefore, the necessity of a standstill in people's move. So all countries should move in that direction. That's a great lesson coming from the rest. The second lesson that we learned is the following. We need to reduce the degree of informality in the labor markets. In all developing countries, the percentage of the labor force in informal occupations, non-registered, not tracked, ranges from something between, for instance, 45% in Brazil to 95% in most African countries. When you have this degree of informality and so on, social policies, transfers of income, programs of basic minimum income become harder to implement. So I think all these countries should make an effort to map out the poverty pockets in their country so as to be able to support them directly, which includes, of course, integrating the slums. The need to integrate physically, to provide sanitation, to provide the means for slums to be incorporated into the urban settings has been neglected. But now, as we saw with the pandemic experience, either the countries do this or they will remain extremely vulnerable to the dissemination of new disease in those areas, which might strike back even let's say the less poor parts of our country. So in self-interest, the elites living in developing countries should be now in favor of integrating slums and adopting a better treatment to sanitation and health conditions in slums, in the poor locations. Maybe that's one upside coming from this terrible crisis that we've been living through.
Thank you, Dr. Otaviano. Finally, this is the end. I would like to thank the panelists for this amazing webinar, as well as the attendees for joining us today. I would like special thanks to Dr. Ahmad Zein, to Dr. Otaviano Canuto, and lawyer Sandrella Merhej, as well as we'd like to thank Lord Alexander for his recording and effort to record the video and send it to us. Thank you very much. We hope the world will stay safe, and we hope to see everyone is recovering, economy is growing, the normals are changing to the better. Thank you very much, and I'm ending the recording now.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure, Dr. Otaviano and Sandrella and all attendees. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.